In 2018, after a lengthy interrogation, Thomas Perez Jr. admitted to killing his father, stating that after an argument he had murdered him with a pair of scissors and disposed of the body. This was a confession that took Fontana police over 17 hours to extract from Perez, and one that mentally broke down Perez so much that he was subsequently admitted to a mental hospital. Only there was just one small detail overlooked by the detectives, and that was the fact that Perez's father, Thomas Perez Sr., was still alive, with no idea his son was in an 8-foot by 10-foot room confessing to his supposed murder. This all started back on October 7th, 2018, when Mr. Perez, who I will address the father as from now on for the sake of clarity, went on a walk with his dog, a border collie named Margot, around the time of 10 p.m. This was not an uncommon occurrence, and was something that Mr. Perez did frequently. But shortly after, his son, who I will try to refer to as Thomas, stepped outside into the cool August evening air to find his father's dog happily bounding up to him, his father nowhere to be seen. Thomas would wait for his 71-year-old father for several more hours, staying up the entire night, anticipating his return. In fact, he would wait almost 16 hours for his father, but naturally began to become increasingly worried as he failed to make contact, and Mr. Perez failed to return home. Eventually fearing the worst, praying his father had not suffered some kind of accident, Thomas called the police to report his father missing. Little did he know, however, only hours after his call, the police would determine his father was the victim of a heinous murder, and the primary suspect was him. Police initially reached out to Thomas, asking him to come to the station so that they could ask him several questions about his father's whereabouts. Thomas saw no reason to expect anything strange, and as a result, willingly went to the Fontana police station. Almost immediately, the police delivered devastating news to Thomas, that being that his father, 71-year-old Thomas Perez Sr., was dead, a victim of a gruesome and bloody murder. But before Thomas could even begin to attempt to process this information, he was hit with another bombshell, that being the fact the police had what they referred to as overwhelming evidence that the murder was committed by him. This can't be right, Thomas thought, or maybe it was even some kind of twisted joke. He didn't kill his father. He knows this. After all, he was the one who called for help. He was the one who reported his father missing. He was the one who willingly came to the station to help to provide more information to the police. But the detectives were positive, or so they claimed, as they proceeded to go on from suggesting Thomas may have killed his father, to stating that he had, to even suggesting the medication Thomas took, which they refused to give him and was meant to treat his anxiety and depression, had caused him to black out and commit the crime. This jump from possible suspicion to accusation to cause all came while Thomas was in the room with detectives. Thomas was in disbelief. According to a 2022 deposition, he was shocked, upset, and at a loss for words, reportedly telling the detectives repeatedly that they were nuts. But again, all through the night, the Fontana police continued to grill Thomas, telling him they knew he was guilty. Meanwhile, police obtained a search warrant and began searching his home. Although I am unsure of what the search warrant said or what the police have the right to do in such a search as declared in such a warrant, it is reported that a couch in the Perez household was cut open with a knife, a hot tub was moved and its motor damaged, contents from the drawers were spilled out onto the ground. Police would also bring a canine unit reportedly described as a cadaver dog by the warrant, and claimed it had picked up some kind of trail inside the home, specifically in the hallway, despite it later being revealed that the dog was not an official police canine and had actually belonged to a sheriff's department volunteer. Although that does not outright negate the possibility the dog is trained to locate cadavers and corpses, it does not guarantee it either. Police would also use a chemical known as luminol, specifically Blue Star, to attempt to reveal bloodstains on the property and within the home, and reported finding a large amount of blood, even going as far as calling the discovery conclusive, despite this alleged find never being confirmed in a lab, with no officers testifying that they had seen any blood. Remember this, because this will come up again later. It is also important to note that this chemical is known to have false positives, and can sometimes react like it would when blood is found, when coming in contact with things like food particles and paint. Several articles have mentioned that at the time of the police search, when the Blue Star was used, the Perez household was being renovated. The following morning, after Thomas was forced to sleep on the floor of the interrogation room, police loaded him into a car where they drove him around the city of Fontana, trying to get Thomas to take them to the location of Mr. Perez's body. He continued to deny any wrongdoing and continued to beg for his medication. The police, however, only continued to push the suggestion the medication had caused him to commit the horrible crimes he was accused of. One transcript stating a detective said, "Where can you take us to show us where Daddy is? The medication, it took over. We need to find Daddy right now." One thing I would like to point out is the officer's frequent use of the name or word Daddy. I am unsure if this is what Thomas refers to his father as, but in the US, Daddy is frequently used by children, often eventually favoring and transitioning to Dad, sometime during adolescence. And although I could not find his exact age, with Mr. Perez being 71 at the time, that could easily mean Thomas is or was in his 40s. So although it may be speculation on my part, I wonder if this could be another manipulation attempt by the detectives. Back at the station, things only got worse, as the detectives' tactics became more and more cruel, as they itched to get a confession after spending hours grilling Thomas. One such tactic was bringing his father's dog into the interrogation room and claiming the dog had become traumatized, having to witness Thomas murder his father. The police even went as far as forcing Thomas to tell Margot goodbye, stating that she had become so traumatized by Thomas's actions that she would need to be euthanized. Despite this claim, the dog showed no apprehension around Thomas and is even seen laying with him in several stills from the interrogation. By now, Thomas had been held for who knows how long, and the police were racking up a long list of lies. Lies that would ultimately be unimportant if they managed to get a confession out of Thomas. So in an effort to do just that, they began lying even more, and brought in family friend Carl Preza to help try and get a confession out of Thomas. When he arrived, Preza was informed that they had, and I quote, "overwhelming evidence of Perez's guilt." And although Preza knew Thomas and Mr. Perez to have a very good and very loving relationship, the police are telling him that they have overwhelming evidence. So Preza does as he is asked and goes into the interrogation room alone and tries to get Thomas to confess. According to Preza, he told Thomas that he was in very, very big trouble and that he was being charged with murder, imploring him, begging him to try to recall what happened, and trying to get him to remember where his father's body was. But like the detectives, Thomas repeatedly tells Preza that he was innocent. Sensing a dead end, a stalemate, Preza leaves. However, as he left the interrogation room, police informed him that they did not actually have what they had originally described as overwhelming evidence, instead informing Preza that they did not have any proof of Thomas's guilt. Preza would be quoted in an interview or deposition stating that the detectives' wording went from overwhelming to circumstantial. There were no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Fontana detectives had deceived Preza in an attempt to get him to aid in their efforts to get Thomas to confess. A dishonest tactic that is surely illegal, right? Well, dishonest, yes. Illegal, perhaps not. Because although I am sure we're all squirming listening to the police outwardly lie about Thomas's involvement, the 1969 Supreme Court case Frazier v. Cupp determined police were actually allowed to lie in an attempt to get a confession. These lies included falsely telling the suspect that his associate had already confessed, lying about what others told them or what evidence reveals, and verbally making false statements about evidence, among other things. But still, Preza was deceived in an effort to get his friend to confess to a crime he may not have committed, and although it may have been legal, it's not what Preza wanted. But when he attempted to re-enter the interrogation room to inform Thomas of this, and that the evidence was purely circumstantial, which frankly still sounds like a stretch, he was prevented from doing so by the police, and was possibly escorted off the property. Thomas Perez had almost been held for 17 hours at this point, and between the mental manipulation, lack of access to medication, and all-around pestering from the detectives who continued to reaffirm their theory on Thomas's medication leading to the murder, the detectives finally got what they wanted, and Thomas confessed to murdering his father. He confessed that yes, he had gone into a fight with his father, as police had suggested. Yes, he had stabbed his father in the stomach with a pair of scissors, as police had suggested. And yes, he had rolled up the body of his father in a shower curtain, disposing of it, as police had suggested. Satisfied, the detectives left the room, leaving Thomas alone. However, this was not just a confession for the sake of confessing, With his steadily declining mental health, Thomas actually began to wonder if what the detectives had told him was true, if he really had murdered his father and simply didn't remember. So while the detectives were off dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's in Thomas's confession, as well as continuing their search of his home, Thomas attempted to depart by tying a slipknot made out of his shoelaces. However, luckily, or unluckily for him, the laces would break and his life would be spared. Thomas then spent several hours lying on the floor of the interrogation room in a fetal position with Margot. That was, however, until police located and interviewed Thomas's sister in North California, who informed them that not only was her father, Mr. Perez, alive, he was healthy, and she knew exactly where he was. The truth was that 2 days prior, Mr. Perez had not gone on a walk. He had left to go visit and stay at a friend's house, and then got ready and went to LAX to catch a flight over to Oakland to visit his daughter. I'm unsure if she was the daughter he had visited and was now flying back from, or if Mr. Perez was on his way to visit a third individual. But this daughter was also able to confirm that Mr. Perez had not informed Thomas of this trip. This, however, could have been for a number of reasons and is not a crime. Police headed to LAX, where Mr. Perez allegedly was, and confirmed that yes, he was still very much alive. Now, the police had to own up to their very, very big mistake. They needed to walk up to Mr. Perez and confess what they had done to his son, and confess to Thomas that the crime that they had forced him to confess to, after 17 hours of interrogation, didn't happen, but likely in a moment of panic, they decided they weren't going to do that, and instead took Mr. Perez into custody after reading him his rights for an unknown reason. Then, in another baffling move, 2 hours after confirming Mr. Perez's liveliness, detectives saw the deteriorated state they had left his son in, and due to the recent attempt on his own life in their own interrogation room, took him to a mental hospital, placing him on a 5150 hold. This is a section of the Welfare and Institutions Code, which allows somebody to be involuntarily detained in a psychiatric hospital for a 72-hour period, according to UCLAHealth.org. Police also informed the staff at the hospital Thomas was not allowed to have outside communications and was not allowed to receive any phone calls, and left him there without ever informing him his father was still alive. Furthermore, they then dropped Margot off at a shelter without providing the staff with any information on who her owners were. Despite the detectives' claims Margot might be euthanized due to the trauma she had allegedly witnessed, she was actually in danger of being put down now due to the fact that she had a leg injury that required surgery and was possibly thought to be a stray dog. She was only saved, however, thanks to the fact that she was microchipped, and the shelter, thanks to their due diligence, was able to find out who her owners were. I am unsure if Thomas was released prior to the 72 hours concluding, or if he was forced to remain at the hospital for the entirety of the stay, for Thomas would eventually be picked up by Pereza, the friend who was tricked into attempting to get Thomas to confess, and brought home to his father, who had also been released from police custody. The exact reason of his detainment still unknown. This traumatic experience occurred in 2018, and since then, Thomas has still suffered from the lasting effects of the mental anguish he suffered. But, like an infomercial from the early 2000s, there's more. Because the Fontana police, even after this baffling mishandling of justice, managed to obtain a search warrant to place a GPS tracker on Thomas's car, claiming to be convinced that despite the fact Mr. Perez was safely located, there may possibly be a third, as of yet unknown individual who may have been murdered by Thomas, likely all stemming from the possible hit from the alleged cadaver dog that entered the Perez's home. Again, no evidence of a murder or murdered individual was ever discovered by the police. In August of 2019, Thomas would officially sue the city of Fontana, stating that he believed his constitutional rights had been violated. This ultimately included several allegations against the police, including things like claims of unlawful searches. However, the detectives involved would say in a deposition held around 2022 that they acted according to their training, and the city of Fontana would back up that they believed the police acted lawfully and as they should. The judge residing over the case would ultimately side with the officers on some of the matters, dropping several of Thomas's supposed complaints, but would be conflicted on others, and as a result, ultimately ruled that the case would need to go to trial, and a jury would need to decide whether or not the officers involved had violated Thomas's rights. Despite the claims that they had not broken the law, the city would settle before this went to court, and as a result, just last month, the city of Fontana would pay Thomas Perez Jr. $890,000. Afterwards, the city of Fontana would release a statement regarding the settlement. Although it is a little long, I will be reading it in its entirety. The city of Fontana recently entered into a settlement agreement regarding an August 2019 Fontana Police Department homicide investigation. The case began when Mr. Thomas Perez reported that his father was missing, and an in-depth investigation transpired that initially showed that Mr. Perez's father was likely the victim of a violent act. News reports regarding the settlement have sometimes failed to include or emphasize several important facts. These facts include the following. The court did not find any Fontana Police Department officer had violated state or federal law during the investigation. The city of Fontana vigorously denies that they violated any state or federal law during the investigation. Additionally, the court found that as the investigation proceeded, the Fontana Police Department had good legal cause to suspect Mr. Thomas Perez of serious criminal activity. Specifically during the investigation, law enforcement officers uncovered evidence and acts indicating that Mr. Perez's father was a victim of a violent crime. Blood evidence was recovered inside of the residence which Mr. Perez and his father shared. There were signs of a violent struggle, including broken furniture and the house in disarray. A cadaver canine specifically trained to alert to the presence of human decomposition alerted to the presence of human remains inside the residence. Additionally, after his father went missing, Mr. Perez discarded all of his father's clothing, bedding, and a shower curtain from the residence. Mr. Perez was asked to voluntarily come to Fontana Police Department to discuss his father's whereabouts, and he agreed to do so. During the next several hours, Mr. Perez was interviewed as the investigation continued. Mr. Perez was not isolated in an interview room for 17 hours, as reported on various news outlets. To the contrary, because the investigation required additional time, Mr. Perez was fed multiple times and was taken to a local coffee shop where he was able to freely walk into the location without an escort to provide an interview break. He was then driven to various locations to speak with detectives regarding the case. The settlement in this case was a business decision which was recommended by a federal court mediator to save the city further time, effort, and expense. Again, the parties' written settlement agreement contains no admission of wrongdoing by anyone, and Mr. Perez specifically agreed to settlement on these terms. Had Mr. Perez requested an admission of wrongdoing, the case would have never settled. This incident occurred nearly 5 years ago. Since that time, city law enforcement leadership have developed many service enhancements to deal with mentally challenged individuals. Since this video has been very much sided with Perez, hopefully seeing the city's opinion will be beneficial to you making your own decisions. I would like to make one note, however, that being that the statement had begun saying the murder investigation had occurred in August of 2019. This is actually a mistake from what I can tell, with the murder investigation occurring in August of 2018 and the first legal complaint being filed in August of 2019. Thomas says he still finds it difficult to speak about what he had gone through and the mental state he had allegedly been placed in by the detectives. And as a result, from what I have seen, almost no member of the family, that being Thomas, Mr. Perez, or Pereza, have provided an interview in regards to the situation. And almost all accounts have been taken from legal filings and a 2022 deposition. And any request for comment, even today, is usually directed to their lawyer. Since the settlement, the 3 officers named in the lawsuit remained employed with the city of Fontana, 2 still operating as law enforcement, and 1 reportedly retired on a pension. Although Mr. Perez was never actually murdered, it is reported that around 1/3 of all murder convictions overturned by DNA evidence included a false confession, with only 1/3 of those being from individuals 18 and under. Meaning on average, if my math is correct, the police have managed to get 20% of adults convicted of a murder that was later overturned to confess, despite being innocent. Well, that's about it. If you like this video, why not check out this one about a father who adopted and abused 9 boys. Subscribe, and I'll see you next time.